Well, hello everybody. Tonight we're going to have Colin Blair talk to us, and most of you should be familiar with Colin, but he's a Microsoft MVP, part of Microsoft Integration is his MVP category, and I'm already butchering this. And one of these things is a Microsoft MVP is somebody that really does some things above and beyond for Microsoft and has a knowledge above and beyond in terms of Microsoft technologies and such, but they're not Microsoft employees. He's been born in this area, so he's a native Springfieldian, and he never got away. So I guess that's his excuse for being here in Springfield. Currently works at IDOT, and right now he's the project lead for Open RIA Services. And Microsoft donated RIA services to Outer Curve, and currently he's the project lead. And that's something that's happened in the recent past, and he's going to be talking about that today in general. But as a side note, besides just doing this, he has another little techie occupation. He's one of the hosts of an internet radio called PTR Radio. And so when he isn't doing something in RIA Services or doing something on computers, he's doing internet radio stuff. So go ask him about it sometime. But again, welcome, Colin.
Thank you. Just to clarify, MVP just basically means that I spend a lot of time answering questions on the internet. That's there's like different categories of. If you answer some questions, they give you like one award. But when you kind of, yes, when you become obsessive about helping people, then they give you MVP instead. Okay, so I'm talking about Open RIA Services. As people who know me know, RIA Services is probably my favorite thing to talk about. It has been since it was first released back in 2008. So, but now I am the project lead for Open RIA Services. So now I more officially blabbermouth about RIA Services. This is my quick agenda for what I'm going to be doing. First, I'm going to be actually doing a quick demo of the original WCF RIA Services. That's what has been donated by Microsoft to become Open RIA Services. The difference between WCF RIA Services and Open RIA Services, beyond its name, is that WCF RIA Services actually works, where Open RIA Services has been in existence for about a month and a half, and mostly is just a bunch of namespace changes at the moment. I'm also going to talk about what it took to open source RIA Services. I know every time that Microsoft or some other company decides to stop doing something, or stop actively working on software, there's always the call for, well, you should just open source it. So with RIA Services, that actually did happen. We actually did get Microsoft to open source it. So I wanted to talk a bit about how that happened and give some tips for people in the future. How can you get Microsoft to open source something for you? And then the last section, we're going to be talking about what is going to be happening with Open RIA Services in the future. So, WCF RIA Services first came out in, I think, 2008 in beta. At the time, it was called .NET RIA Services. It was part of Silverlight for line of business tooling. Originally, it was .NET RIA Services. According to one of the project managers for Silverlight, it was an answer for a problem that didn't need to be solved. He also said that they probably shouldn't have greenlit it in the first place, but the source that was being created by the team was so good they just had to let it go. So I'm actually going to explain, I'm actually going to give a quick demo of, you've actually already seen this diagram if you were at my last talk when I was talking about single page application. So this is a quick diagram of what a Silverlight line of business application looks like. Multiple tiers, you have a database, you have a server, you have a business layer, and you have a client. One of the major differences that we had with Silverlight was that you have a client which cannot connect directly to a database. So for a lot of programmers, it was the first time where you had a client that was fully .NET, has all the coding you want to do to create a rich client application, but you were not able to attach directly to a database. You did not have Entity Framework. You didn't have any of those tools that you might have been used to. So RIA Services was a solution to that problem. So what I'm going to do is do a quick demo of RIA Services. This is in condensed form the demo you would have seen when RIA Services was first announced back in 2008. A few differences. I'm going to be doing code second instead of an EDMX file. So what I'm going to do is here I'm going to do this the whole thing as quickly as I can. So if you get lost, first off, don't worry about it because I'm creating a Silverlight application and you probably don't care about how to create Silverlight applications. And I'm going to come back and explain the parts that are important. So it comes up, I'm going to click Enable WCF RIA Services. I'm going to hit OK. And we'll get rid of the welcome screen. And so then first I'm going to create my domain model. How many have heard the term code second? Nobody? So there's database first, which is the EDMX file, and there's code first. The EF team knows these are stupid terms, but that's the terms they got stuck with. Code second is when you're doing code first, but you're reverse engineering from an existing database. So I have a database on here called School. It's actually used by the EF team for demoing how to do code second. So what it's doing right now is it's actually going out to the database and it's creating a EF code first domain model. And then I'm going to build that. Oops. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to an existing project. I just remembered I don't have internet, so NUG is going to fail. Okay, so this is the same thing as I just did. So there's the school model. Okay, so we're going to add a domain service. I'm going to name this school domain service. Then here's the entities from my domain model. And I'm going to select them all. And select them all. And I'm going to hit OK. And then I'm going to build. This is a Silverlight application here. So clear off. So then you go in here and you have your data sources. And you can see the same entities that were in the domain model. I'm going to bring down course. So I'm just going to drag it over here. I'm going to have this grid. And then I'm going to bring in, let's see, credits and title. run it. Okay, so there's my grid. Got a couple boxes down here, or click in the grid and it changes so I have a master detail view. So that's cool, but then I want some business rules. So I'm going to do is go to my model here. Oops. For the course. See, I already did it. So this is how I would add a business rule to my model. So here I say they have a range attribute, and I'm going to say the credits have to be between 0 and 7. So you can see if I come in and say there's 23 credits, then the box turns red. And if I hover my mouse over it, then I've got this nice little validation thing that says credits has to be between 0 and 7. So that is the original demo for WCF RIA Services. It was really nice for how to do a demo in a few minutes to say, ooh, look, I can create a Silverlight line of business application and not have to write any code other than put some attributes on an entity to do some validation. That is the answer that didn't really need to be. I mean, that's the question that really didn't need to be answered. Nobody really wants to create applications without writing code, especially with something like Silverlight, which was the whole point was you could do an application in a browser writing C#. Also, this type of quick grid and text box editor is something like MVC is really good at. So the original full story of WCF RIA Services was a failure. That's great, Colin. Why are we missing Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. to find out about something that was a bad idea? Well, the trick is that while this was a bad idea, the code that made all of this possible was actually really cool, really useful. The problem that I had was I needed to write this line of business application in Silverlight, and I had lots of business rules. And I didn't want to have to write business rules twice. But I needed them on the client. I needed to be able to have this red box that could say credits have to be between 0 and 7. But I also wanted it on the server where I could make sure that no one was getting around my rules. So that's really, really cool. I really needed this. This is exactly what I was looking for. What I didn't need was drag and drop programming. So let's go back and look at what actually I just created and how that actually could be used outside of this drag and drop world. So I created a school domain service. This is the heart of the server. This is the server-side heart of RIA Services. This is what makes it a service. So you can see it's a DB domain service, and it has the type of the DB context, school context, being passed in through a generic. And so what's going to happen is that the domain service finds out everything about your domain model. So it knows what your entities are, and it knows everything about the entities. So if the database says that a string field is 5 characters long, then the domain service is going to find out about that, and it's going to automatically put a rule on that string to say that it cannot be longer than 5 characters. It knows what fields are required based off of can it be null in the database. So if you have a string and it can't be null, then it'll put a required attribute automatically on it so that it knows that it's required. Now inside this domain service, we have a bunch of methods. And let me get more room here for you. So like for courses here, we have an iQueryable course, get courses, and it returns back all the courses from the DB context. We have the insert course method, an update course method, and a delete course method. There are other technologies such as data services that use a different paradigm of automatically generating this code. RIA Services is all about business logic, and it's all about security by default. So it puts these methods here, and you can see that it has lots of these to-dos around it, telling you that you should really consider putting security and validation on your methods. So like on this online courses, you could come in here and you could say dot let's see. Here we go, zip code. So you could say that the zip code, oops, that was, sorry, that's completely nonsensical. Okay. You could do something like that where you are limiting what's being returned to a specific thing. Now, when you compile, you can see we have this generated code folder over on the client side. This code is generated based off of what your domain service does. So on the server, you have a domain model, and then you have a domain service which defines a subset of that domain model. So this currently this domain service is exporting all of the entities, and it has update, insert, delete for all those entities. I could only have one of them. And so my domain model in the client would be only what was exposed. And also if I didn't have a update, insert, delete method, then that entity would be read-only on the client-side domain model. So here in this generated code, I have every one of, I'll just drop this down. You can see I have all the entities, and they inherit the RIA Services entity. And they each have a property that matches the properties that were on, let's see, if I look at course. Okay. So you can see, like, here's course ID. You can see course ID has been marked editable false because it's the primary key. You can see it's also been marked as the key. And it also stuck a round trip original on it because we always want to make sure we have the primary key on the server. So on the server side entity, that's that property. You can also see, if I go down to don't know what it's doing. Sorry. Okay, so you can see here on the credits, we can see that we have that range attribute that I put on the server side. So whatever we do on the server, so if I come over here and change this to 10, and I build, then we see that the client side automatically changes. So the client side code, every time you build, automatically gets modified to match whatever you did on the server. It matches a thing called dry, don't repeat yourself, which is one of the points of RIA Services, is to say, don't repeat yourself. If you're going to write your business logic once on the server, don't have to be writing it again on the client. So, let's show you real quick. Here we go. So this is an example of what some of the code actually looks like when we're using RIA Services. So what we're doing here, I kind of lost. This is the code that's being used by that screen stuff. So on the screen there's a control there called the domain data source. And the domain data source is what did all of the binding on the screen to do the drag and drop programming. What I'm looking at here is I'm showing you the actual code that was written to make the domain data source be able to do anything. The domain data source, in my opinion, is trash. It should never be used. I've spent the last several years helping people who saw the original demo and they tried to write an application using those techniques. And then they quickly hit the brick wall of, I need a second grid, and I need both of those grids to save at the same time. Or I need a drop-down combo box where it also doesn't really work unless you have only one on the screen. So for the last several years, people come to me and they say, I need help. And what I have to tell them is, rip out what you did, do it with code instead. But the code here is what, to me, is the best, is what makes RIA Services worth it. So you can see here I have I'm using one of my entities called department. And I can just construct a new department. And I can construct, and I can add a new course. So I named this soccer department. And I have a kicking course for the soccer department. And so I just added it. This is very similar to the type of coding that you'd be used to with Entity Framework. RIA Services' basic design was based off of Entity Framework. So a lot of the same wording is used and a lot of the same coding style. I'll say right there, RIA Services is completely agnostic on DAOs. So it can be Entity Framework, it can be linked to SQL, it can be in Hibernate, it could be POCOs, you could be writing SQL directly to stored procedures. The only real rule that RIA Services has is you need to have primary keys. So if you don't have a primary key, it's not an entity. If it's not an entity, we don't do anything with it. And we need foreign key information, which does cause some problems with a lot of Hibernate models, because Hibernate likes to just completely hide foreign key information. But when we're sending entities across the wire, foreign keys are really important. So the next thing here is the domain context. So the domain context is what takes data from the domain service on the server and the domain model on the client and moves data back and forth. So the way we do that is we do something like context dot load context dot courses dot where that's the title. Okay. So that would load data from the domain service into my local domain model on the client side. What that would do is it would actually take that query and it would transmit the query to the server. The server would then run that query against the database and then return the results. So it doesn't like go get all of the courses, send them to the client, and then filter them on the client. So we can do where statements. We can also do takes and skips. So for paging purposes, you can say, give me the top 10, give me the top 10, skip 10. That'll give you the next 10 after the first 10. Stuff like that. To modify an entity, you just change it directly. You know, you'd say title equals there. Now this, instead of soccer, it's now football for everybody above us. And then to actually update the database, you would say context dot submit changes. Now, when you submit a RIA Services, it does two things. One, it makes sure that everything's valid. So if any business rule validations are failing, it will not send anything to the server. The second thing is that everything is sent as a unit of work. So one change set with all of the changes that you currently have is sent to the server. If anything fails, then the entire thing is rolled back and you get a list of errors on the client and you know that nothing actually got saved, so you have the ability to fix it and save changes, submit changes a second time. Also important to know, Silverlight is always async contacting the server. So this logic here, this load and this submit changes is actually async. It doesn't say, it doesn't have the naming that you would think would be async. Part of that's because this is all pre-async being built into C# as it is now. But also just because everything in Silverlight was async, they decided that there was no reason to put the word begin every single time. So instead of saying context.begin load and context.begin submit changes, they just said load and submit changes. So that's basically what WCF RIA Services was being used for. It was being used as a client-side domain model that was generated based off of the domain model on the server. It was used as a way to get business logic generated on the server, copied to the client without having to write it twice. And this is the general, guts of writing a line of business application. Before I go on, any questions on this? Nope. So real quick, let's see where we at. I have an hour, okay. I just wanted to, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I just wanted to show it to you. This is what a real RIA Services application that's actually written using best practices looks like. This is the bookshelf application, originally written by John Papa, and slightly modified by Kyle McClellan, who was on the RIA Services team. So you can see, if you're familiar with WPF or Windows Store applications or Silverlight applications, you see a lot of nomenclature here used to view models, views, that kind of thing, and services. So this is how RIA Services is being used here. So a view model, the user level code would call load books by category and passed in a category ID and a query builder object and a callback. So this code would call the domain context and do a load against it. Using the query builder. So the query builder was an interesting object created by the RIA Services team. It has the ability to write a link query that can either run against the in-memory store of that entity or against the server to do a load with. So you could come in and say like, you could do a link query of books with the author of J.R.R. Tolkien, and then you could pass it to your backend service, and the backend service could then say to your in-memory store, do I have any books? If I do, then I can return those immediately, and then I can go and I can do a load against the server and say, do I have any other books by J.R.R. Tolkien? And then later, those would load from the server, and then you can give those back to the client too. So the query builder was really nice for passing back information that could either be either side of the fence. The other, where's it? And that's this apply to. So with the apply to from the query builder, you can either apply it to the domain context, or you can apply it to the entity set. Entity set is what we named the in-memory collection of entities is called. So you can see that RIA services can be used this way. It's completely separated from your view model code. You can write code using RIA services that doesn't require RIA services. Your view model doesn't know what RIA services is. It's just asking for entities. And then this code here is what is actually going off and doing it. Anyway, this is the other important object that was added. It's called entity list. Entity list actually inherits an observable collection. So we actually pass it as observable collection to the rest of the code. But what it was is an observable collection that knows about RIA services. So if you add a new entity to the observable collection, it actually adds it to the context behind the scenes. And then if you delete from the observable collection, it actually deletes it from the context. So you can imagine, like from entity framework, it's like you had something that is a collection that knows nothing about entity framework, but when you delete an entity from it, it actually deletes it from the database. And if you add it to the collection, it actually adds it to the database without the code ever actually knowing that there was a database there to be dealing with. So if you're ever interested in what the code actually is supposed to look like, this is actually on my original blog. So, okay. So that was WCF RIA Services. It's not terribly exciting unless you write a lot of line of business applications and you find yourself writing business logic and then having to write it a second time or a third time because you have different layers of your app. So what happened to RIA Services? First off, Silverlight fell. You might remember this graphic I did last time, what happened to Silverlight. So mobile platforms became more important. There's a general bias against plugins. Apple decided that Flash and Silverlight would not be allowed on iOS. The primary reason Silverlight existed in the first place was to compete against Flash and Air. The idea of application platforms that could run on everything was a threat to Microsoft. And they wanted something that could compete with that could also be on multiple platforms. So Silverlight was on the Mac, it was on Windows, it was on Linux with the Moonlight project. But once Flash was effectively dead, because it wasn't going to be allowed on iOS, that also, it killed Silverlight, not just because Silverlight was also not going to be on iOS, but because Flash was dead. And the reason Silverlight existed was because of Flash. Also, Silverlight was becoming too powerful. It was gaining the ability to be trusted, and so it had the ability to, on the client, talk to COM, and generally be a fully capable Windows desktop platform, which was a threat to Windows itself as far as the Windows team was concerned. So that's why Silverlight failed. When you compete with Windows, it becomes, and you don't have any other reason to exist, it becomes a bad thing. Although, in many, many ways, the Windows Store applications are the next version of Silverlight. Also, if you do anything with Mono, like Mono Droid and Mono on iOS, the version of .NET that they're using is basically their original version of Silverlight or Moonlight. So a lot of the APIs, what the Mono people say is that if you want to know what parts of .NET they support, look at what parts of .NET were supported by Silverlight. That's what they support. And then they've added more since then. Next thing that happened was loss of staff. So even with Silverlight going away, WCF RIA Services itself still has a lot of potential. I mean, it doesn't have to be just on Silverlight. It could have been on WPF. Actually, it turns out there always was a WPF version of RIA Services. It was actually written first, and it's what all the unit tests were written against. As far as anyone knows, it has never actually been used to write a WPF application. It only has been used for unit tests. But what we're seeing now is we're seeing lots of platforms like Silverlight where you have a client that can't connect directly to the database. So we're seeing that on the phones, we're seeing that with Windows Store applications. The idea of needing a domain model that can be created on the server and talk to the database, and then a new domain model can be generated on the client, that still has a lot of merit. It's the point of Open RIA Services. But there was a potential for Microsoft doing that. This is a lot of the original WCF RIA Services team at Microsoft. So one of the reasons why WCF RIA Services didn't continue in Microsoft can be explained by saying, from left to right, Azure Mobile Services, Xbox, Google, project lead of NuGet. So that's what each of those people is doing now. The RIA Services team had a lot of extremely good programmers, and they were poached. Jeff Handley on the far right is the one responsible within Microsoft of getting RIA Services open sourced. He told me that there was a lot of chance for RIA Services still continuing at Microsoft, except for he couldn't pass up the opportunity of being project lead for NuGet. As much as I like RIA Services, if I was given the choice between project lead of NuGet and RIA Services, I think I would have gone the same way he did. And the third thing is, it turned out not to be a good fit for Microsoft. As I showed, the original RIA Services, as the original demo showed, it's a tooling story. And Microsoft is very good at doing tooling. So the ability to create a user interface without having to write any code, just by using the mouse, that's great for Microsoft. When people like me decided that using the mouse thing was stupid, and we just really liked the class library part of it, that became something Microsoft is terrible at. To be a class library that's doing line of business and is allowing you to keep generating this stuff, you need something that can quickly be revved. You know, people come in, they say, I need to do this, and you go in and you make that change, it can do that, and you put a new version out on NuGet. And you keep doing that over and over again. That's what RIA Services needed. But it was budgeted and designed from Microsoft's standpoint as something that was being released every couple of years whenever a new version of Visual Studio was released. As something that's being released as part of Visual Studio, that's just too slow. It was fine as a tooling thing, but not as a class library. Microsoft in general is not good at something that's going to be fast. And it's not just because it's not a organizational, it's not a problem. It's just what people expect of them. When people get something from Microsoft, they expect it to work that way. It can't be something that 2 months later they realize, oh, that was bad, we need to change the API slightly. And that's going to be a breaking change. Microsoft can't do breaking changes. It'd be a bad thing if they tried, because that's their position in our industry. Their position in the industry is to make something that we expect to be there for years. It's like Silverlight. Silverlight is not being upgraded, but it's still there. It still works. People like myself are still using it daily because it's extremely stable, it's fully supported by Microsoft, and it does what we need it to do. And that is what Microsoft does. So, about just over a year ago now, you remember last spring I did a talk on single page application. And I explained that parts of single page application were being based off of RIA services. That part of SPA was cut, mostly because they'd lost too many personnel, and also there's too many other things in the industry that were doing the same thing. And so Microsoft decided that they were better off letting companies like with Breeze.js and stuff like that do it instead. And so I put out a blog entry that basically said, today RIA Services died. Then I said, but we should open source it. The first conversation with Microsoft on open sourcing it was the next day. And then that process continued until very recently. So as I explained, as I promised, here's how to get Microsoft to open source something. First off, you can't just say they should open source it. The worst thing that a company, the worst thing that a company like Microsoft can do is just take some code and announce it's open source, throw it out on GitHub or Codeplex and say, there you go. That's actually considered very bad practice. For one thing, it just looks awful. It looks like they don't want to support you anymore. They just want to throw it out in the trash and say, here, do it yourself. But just in the open source community, that's just really, it's like taking a rotten egg and throwing it in the middle of the room. So what you need is you need a champion. You need someone inside Microsoft willing to put the work in to make it happen. Jeff Hanley was the champion for RIA Services. If you don't have someone inside Microsoft who's interested and will put in a year of hard work and meetings and calling up really important people at Microsoft, like Scott Guthrie, and saying, hey, we need to do this, it's going to be very difficult. The second thing you're going to need is a vision and a plan. You have to have something that the champion inside Microsoft can sell. You can say, if we open source it, this is what they can do with it, and this is how they can do it. So I came up with a vision for RIA Services, where first I want to support existing Silverlight users. So RIA Services is a big user of Entity Framework, but Entity Framework just completely changed all of its namespaces because it's now open sourced. It is no longer part of the core .NET. It's now a NuGet deployed, completely separate thing, which means that all the existing RIA Services support for Entity Framework breaks. So we want to support the existing users so they can keep using new versions of things like Entity Framework. The second thing I wanted to do was bring RIA Services to all other platforms. So I want to write a Windows Store application. I want to I want my domain model on my server to be the same domain model as I have on my client. and I want my business logic to be there too. So I came up with a plan, 3 branches. Branch 4 is legacy support. So no breaking changes, continuing support for existing RIA Services Silverlight users. They have to change the namespaces in their using statements, but other than that, it should be a drop-in, switch back and forth between Open RIA Services and WCF RIA Services, and there should be very little breaking changes there, other than things that were actually bugs that we needed to fix. Branch 5 is cross-platform support, so that's where we're going to support every other platform that .NET can reach. Branch 6 is Roslyn. So right now, RIA Services uses code DOM and T4 templates to generate code. And we want to switch over to be using Roslyn instead. One of the major reasons for that is that we want to support POCOs on the client. So right now on the client, all of our entities inherit from a RIA Services entity object. And all the code inside them is very code-gen code. It's impossible to do a POCO right now on the client with RIA Services. Using Roslyn, we could actually do some funky stuff like you could have your entity POCO object in a portable class library, and you could use that same portable class library from both the server side and from the client side. And we just on the server side, Entity Framework would use its proxies, and then we would actually have our own proxies on the client side. We thought about actually using the same thing that any framework does, but I had decided that since Roslyn was coming, it'd be a much better idea to use Roslyn for that instead. So this is information that probably only people who actually use RIA Services now care about. These are some things that we're going to be adding to current RIA Services. M2M support is many-to-many. So right now we have to have a linking table in between. And I always have a linking table myself, but there's people who really, really, really want no linking table. So we're going to do that. We've switched over to Silverlight 5 completely. I am adding a change notification system using SignalR so that if person A changes an entity and person B is looking at the same entity, then person B, if person A changes it, then person B's screen automatically refreshes with the updated entity from person A. So instead of waiting for optimistic concurrency, checking later to say, oops, somebody else already edited it, you get it instantly. We're switching to Fluent API for everything. We try to get some native and Hibernate support so that we can get foreign key information direct. There's some bug fixes and some other stuff. Branch 5 is portable class library, and we're going to move to Web API. A lot of stuff in Web API came from RIA Services. RIA Services automates a lot of WCF configuration stuff. And a lot of the same people who worked on that also worked on Web API. So a lot of lessons learned from RIA Services went in the Web API. Since I'm in the middle of changing a lot of code to be portable, I've decided that I would like to use those lessons learned from RIA Services myself. So we're just going to go ahead and move to Web API and get all the new stuff. For HTML JavaScript, we're going to be supporting Breeze. And we're also going to be doing code generation using TypeScript. So if your client is HTML JavaScript, then we'll generate a domain model in TypeScript. And then you'll use Breeze to actually do the job of moving the data between the server side and the client side. As far as current status, the client piece of the actual domain context and the entities, the entity sets, all that stuff has been ported to the portable class library. It turned out the only thing I had to do was, it used to be that on collections there was a .2 read only, and it would cache it to be, so if you had to set an observable collection .2 read only, it'd return a read-only observable collection. Apparently in Windows Store they dropped that. So I just had to change the code to do a new read-only collection and pass it in instead of using the extension. And after that, it compiled. The good thing there was that the code from Silverlight was actually reused back into .NET. So all the coding was written originally for Silverlight for RIA Services now works. I don't have, the piece that actually talks to the service is very Silverlight. That can't be ported directly. But I'm replacing it with HTTP client anyway to go to Web API. So what this means is that we're going to support Monodroid, Mono and iOS, HTML, JavaScript, WPF, Windows Store, console apps, not game console apps, possibly, I don't know. But, basically anything where .NET goes, RIA Services will support. This also gives us the cool thing that if you need to support multiple clients, so you have a iPhone client and an Android client and a Windows client, then we can generate the domain model and business logic for each one of them. And then branch 6 is Roslyn. We'll have client-side POCA support. I'm also looking at some cool things there where we actually, domain controller is the new name for the domain service, by the way. So when we switch to Web API, it'll be called domain controller. But you'll be able to do some things like, with Roslyn, you can do tooling. You know, like in, how many people are familiar with Roslyn? A couple? Okay. So it's compiler as service. It has many different things we can do. But one of the more interesting ones for this is that you can actually do extensions to Visual Studio. Like if you ever used ReSharper and it puts a squiggly under something and it tells you this is a better way to write it, you can do your own using Roslyn like that. So let's see. Oh, it looks like I closed it. Okay. So we can do things like you can go in and say, I want this entity to be exposed. As I showed earlier, domain service, it had a lot of CRUD methods. A lot of people complained that those CRUD methods are very repetitive. So we can say that we can do something closer to like data services does, where you just say, I want to expose this entity, and I want this entity to have create, read, update, and delete. And then behind the scenes, we'll automatically generate the code. I think that's interesting for getting an app up quickly during initial development. I think long-term, you're much better off having those individual methods written. So what we can do is you can say, well, we'll have a squiggly underneath it to say, you really shouldn't be doing this. And you can right-click on the squiggly and click it, and it'll actually will generate the CRUD methods for you to replace that quickly. Forgot to have this up. So this, and I don't have the network. I was going to show you real quick the Open RIA Services website. So it's openriaservices.net is the main RIA Services site. That's where we're doing discussions on future development. The source code is on Codeplex at openriaservices.codeplex.com. And we're fully taking, if you want to code on it, I'm very happy. I'll take as many people who want to contribute code as want to. I'm not going to be sitting around going, only my code can go into RIA services. One thing I've learned very quickly as project lead is that it's very different being the primary MVP telling people about RIA services and being the project lead. It used to be that people would ask me, how does this work with this particular thing? People come up with, I'm using the Sky Caterpillar programming model. How does it fit into that? And I would try to come up with a way that RIA Services works in that. RIA Services is a technology. It's a bit of a disruptive technology. And I've realized that as project lead of RIA Services, it is not my place to tell people how it fits into their different programming model. It is my place to listen to you tell me how it doesn't fit into your model. And it's in my place to try to fix that problem. Where things like doing the client POCO thing. Client-side POCO is something that does conflict with lots of programming models. So I want to try to fix that. Same thing for best practices. I can't be thinking in best practices anymore. I have to, people come to me and they say, I need it to be able to work in this way, and then I need to figure out how it's going to work in that way. Or I decide that doesn't, I can still decide that's a bad idea, but I'm not going to kick it out of the project because of that. So this is a model of what I think the domain controller is going to look like. I'm actually writing the domain controller now, and this is my current thinking on it. So this domain controller is actually using repositories instead of CRUD methods that are inside the domain controller itself. I'll just clean this up a bit. So you can see that just like the domain service, we're actually telling you what context it is. Then they have this thing called on-domain creating. This is kind of like any, how any framework works with its whole way you do Fluent and all that kind of stuff. I'm basing a lot of this stuff. The original RIA Services was based off of what any framework looked at the time. So the new Open RIA Services, I'm looking at what any framework does now. So I get this on-domain creating, and I'm going to be look at this domain builder, and I'm going to add an address repository. It's going to be able to do all operations. So that's create, update, insert, delete. And that's for a role. So if you're using roles, or if you're doing identities with claims, you can say that this is a claim to say that this is an address editor role, and they can do all operations. And I'm going to say that someone who's a contact viewer has the ability to read. They have a personal repository, and same thing, okay. So this is what I'm looking at to say, well, if you already have repositories, and you have repositories written correctly to have an external unit of work, then we can get these repositories used directly by the domain controller. So we don't have any CRUD methods direct. And what I mean by external unit of work is that some people write repositories where the unit of work is inside the repository. The recommended way is that, or it creates their own instance of the DB context. You look at Microsoft's recommendations, they say that the repository should have the DB context passed in so that the save changes can be done externally. So if you write your repositories that way where the DB context is being passed in, then this repository system here in the domain context, that's the way it's going to work. It's going to create an instance of your repository, it's going to pass in the DB context. And then during the save changes process, then it will pass all of the entities that came from the client to your repositories and then commit the unit of work. So that's an example of what I think Open RIA Services is going to look like. I'm also looking at separating a lot of things that were in RIA Services. So lots of places where you can inject stuff into your context. Including to the fact where I think the idea, one thing I'm playing with is that to get rid of the DB domain controller completely, you need to say domain controller and have it in a unit of work, and then have inject the unit of work controller, that so you could actually have like multiple DB contexts for that thing. So everything could be injected by inject or something like that, and that everything at the domain controller level is just there to expose out to the client. The core thing about RIA Services is that we are compile time. So whatever I do is going to be limited to compile time ability. So everything needs to be defined and strongly typed at compile time, because that's what we're going to generate on the client. RIA Services is all about servers and clients that are being developed together. It's not about, I'm going to create a service, and I'm going to stick it on a server, and people I don't know is going to create an application against me. There's lots of other techniques and other things that are designed specifically for that. We're designed specifically for not that. Again, I'm trying very hard as project lead not to lock myself in on anything, though. So if anybody wants to try using RIA Services in a completely client-server separated environment, you're welcome to try. It's just not really something that I care so much about. So that's everything I wanted to say. So questions, I'm always looking for ideas. So what do you need? What of this is something that looks like something you need but isn't quite what you need? What else is there? So.
Okay, first of all, how many active contributors do you have on the project right now?
I have, let's see, I think right now we have 5 or 6 people who have got the CLA signed.
Okay.
I
What?
have CLA,
Oh, okay.
contributor license.
Right.
RIA Services, I forgot to say this, RIA Services was donated by Microsoft to OuterCurve, which is the open source company that was originally started by Microsoft in the first place. So they own the copyrights, and we are doing CLAs for all contributors, so that, which is one of the nice things about OuterCurve is that no one has ever sued a contributor to an open source project, but if someone were to sue, then we're indemnified by OuterCurve, so their lawyers would take care of it. So that's nice. We also get MSDN licenses and ReSharper, stuff like that. So when people get their CLAs signed, I send them out a ReSharper license, which can only be used for Open RIA Services. But
Right.
it's still nice.
Yeah. Just one other thing. If, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but to have you working at IDOT, it's like taking out a Ferrari and driving it through a cornfield, really. I mean, your talent is wasted there. Why don't you, have you ever thought about going to work at Microsoft?
Back before RIA Services started losing all of its employees, I did, there was a position open. I did consider it, but that's when everybody started moving to Google and the Windows team started taking over. It just, that was not a good time to move. But IDOT's been good to me.
You're kidding. No, I believe it. Okay, I've never worked over there, so I can't say.
But we have gotten our first official pull to RIA Services a couple weeks ago, which was awesome because they even had unit tests in it. The unit tests actually are not fully functional because they originally were written for an older Silverlight unit test framework, and then they had a bunch of proprietary stuff they didn't give us that was running it in the back end. So But I was like, great, unit tests. I don't even have working unit. I think we're at like 87% unit test functionality last time I was working on it. But, actually, Mark's going to be working on possibly moving us to X unit, which will be good because then it'll be easier to run the unit tests without Visual Studio.
This is going to go in a different direction, but right now is my mind blanked out right about the time we did it. But right now is Silverlight and RIA Services are also used with LightSwitch, which is kind of like the rapid application builder. And they're kind of promoting it for, yes, you can just kind of auto-generate and set up some schema, and then the screens will just pop up back, which was the original version of Silverlight. Do you have any impressions on that? Because it seems like that's also going to have to migrate because its basis, they're talking about doing it as single-page applications.
LightSwitch, I
Comments
think,
on that?
yeah, LightSwitch is pretty much already migrated. So if you have the current version of LightSwitch, it creates HTML applications. I think it still has some RIA services support. It's not anything I've played with much.
And even 6 months ago, it was like the straight web stuff was pretty immature. But then the thing is, for services, are they moving to like a web API, or are they going to keep the RIA services kind of?
I'm not sure. I know a new version just came out with Visual Studio 2013, and it's basically web oriented now instead of Silverlight oriented. It's not anything I played with.
Okay. Well, it also doesn't fit the disposition of where you want to go with this.
Yeah.
But that was just my curiosity in terms of how it would work on the services side.
Yeah, again, real quick, do you get to use a lot of this stuff at IDOT?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
What kind of applications are they doing over there that use this type of technology?
At IDOT, I work on a system called iHIS, which is actually made up of two subsystems. They're IRIS and ISIS. Actually, the manuals are on the IDOT website. What they are the roadway and structure inventory systems. So we inventory the roads. When you hear about a structure, like a bridge, and they're talking about its current condition and it needs to be repaired or replaced, mine is the system that actually knows what the current status is of all the bridges and calculated it. When they say structurally deficient structures, mine is the system that calculated is it structurally deficient or not. It's a very interesting system in that, especially on the road side, it's a range editor. So when you go on a road, you have what we call stationing. It's like if you looked at the odometer on your car and as you drove along, those are stations. And the way that you edit a road is you say from this mile, from mile 2.7 to 3.8, something changed. Its traffic count is now 20,000. And there might be 12 rows on the grid between those mile stations. And the mile stations may, like, you may be changing at 2.7. The row says 2.5 to 2.9. So what my system does is it actually goes and finds all the rows within the range you just edited, splits any rows that are in between, creates any new rows that need to be created, and it just edits that way. And then when you save, it has to go back through those rows a second time, find any rows that became identical, and merge those together to be one row. So this was a system with lots of business rules and lots of data. I'm basically loading up into a Silverlight application every piece of data we know about a specific road. And then when you,
Use this in the field, like with laptops or something?
no, they don't use it in the field. They mostly use it in the local offices, going across the state network. So the app itself is about 2.5. It's like a 15 gig Silverlight application, and not 15 gig, sorry. It's a 15 meg. It's a 15 meg Silverlight application. And we're bringing down for single road something like 200 rows of data, and then going through and editing rows randomly as the user needs, and then saving all the information as a single unit of work. So everything I know about RIA services originally came from writing those applications and helping other people write their applications. A lot of mapping in the app too, because we draw the roads too, and as you look at the different rows of data, we actually highlight the section of the road that you actually just clicked.
Going to be a comment as an outsider. In other words, imagine this big mapping thing, so all the roadways in the state and all the junk on the roadways and all the statistics on the roadways are all mapped and inventoried in one place, and that's the application. So if you can imagine it, it's got the geographical component, and it's this monster database, and it's all done interactively in a Silverlight app that looks like a local application that's just deployed to anybody internally in IDOT. That's kind of what it looks like externally. I had to look at it externally for, about a month or so. But again, it's not a trivial application, and this is one that as a single page app would kill you technologically right now. The technology just doesn't exist, and this is one that traditionally would be a large application you might put on a very large system and be a desktop system, but it can be done in Silverlight, and the base technology behind it is something that should be available in future technologies. Okay, that's my nickel and dime comment from the outside.
It's why I was interested in single page application. It's the first time I saw something that could in HTML and JavaScript do something that I'd done in Silverlight. It's not ready yet, but I think someday it might be. It probably will be able to. It's also something just my primary users are ones who actually are editing inventory. But we have everybody else in the entire Department of Transportation here in Illinois who just needs to know any information about the roads. And they have the ability to open up the app and on a read-only matter see what the current condition of the roads are, what's the traffic count, who has jurisdiction, all that fun stuff. So as a Windows application, it'd be horrible because we'd actually have to install it on every single computer at IDOT. Whereas a Silverlight application, all you have to do is hit the URL, which is a simple 4-letter URL, which nobody needs to know. And the Silverlight application springs up on their browser, and they're ready to go. We do have Silverlight installed on every machine at IDOT. Yes, Mark? Oh, you're just, okay. Anybody else?